Hello and welcome to Band Literature Reviews with Brandon Searles. Band Literature Reviews is a series that evaluates concert band music from the perspective of a small school director. This is episode 8, Band Music of the 90's. In today's show, we'll do a throwback 30 years, and I will discuss 3 pieces of concert band literature: Cajun Folk Songs, The Great Locomotive Chase, and Equinox. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello again, everybody. Thanks again for joining me. We are chugging along, as it were, into the end of the year once again, and it's getting ever nearer to the day that we will finally be done, and I will be going off to my master's again, which, if you guys are recent joiners, is the reason that I've been doing this project this whole time. We are counting down the days to when that's going to be. I am very excited about that, and looking forward to both of those things. For your listening today, I have 3 pieces of music that are from the 90's. Of course, I relate to this a little bit because I am a product of the 90's myself as well, and perhaps some of you guys are as well who are listening to this. I hope you enjoy these selections that I picked for you guys, because these are some really fun pieces overall, and I really enjoyed reviewing them. Let's go ahead and get into the first one, which is Cajun Folk Songs. Hello everybody and welcome back. Once again, that was Cajun Folk Songs. It's by Frank Ticheli. The key signatures are A minor, no flats or sharps, and F major, one flat for the movements. This is considered a multi-movement or folk piece. It is considered grade level 3. The first movement is 3 minutes and 30 seconds long and 74 measures. The second movement is about 3 minutes long and 132 measures. The publisher is Manhattan Beach Music. It was published in the year 1991. Tempos present in it are 63 beats per minute, 40 beats per minute, and in the second movement, 160 beats per minute and 88 beats per minute. Moving into some facts about the composer. If you've watched my previous episodes, I've reviewed pieces of him before. The one that I reviewed last time was Abracadabra. We talked a bit about that. Another piece of his is Angels in the Architecture. He also does Blue Shades, and following up from that episode, I don't get to play Blue Shades, but there's a very strong chance I'll get to play Vesuvius by him, which is a very, very, very fun piece. Moving on to the grade level. This is definitely hard for the grade level listed, mostly because of the multimeter elements of it. The 5/4 time in the second movement especially being of note. Instrumentation, there are lots of demands as far as numbers of instruments. There are 3 each of the percussion parts, the clarinet parts, the trumpet parts, and the trombone parts. Everything else is 2 of each, except for a few exceptions, which are euphonium, there's 1 part, tuba, bari sax, tenor sax, and bass clarinet. Those are the only ones that have 1 part for that instrument. It also calls for an E-flat contrabass clarinet, which once again is kind of like a color type instrument that would be not entirely necessary from what I've seen, and would just add a lot of great color if you had one, but let's be honest, small schools like us, if we have an E-flat contrabass clarinet, that would be absolutely crazy. Moving on to percussion instrumentation, the percussion parts call for marimba, sandblocks, castanets, and 4 concert toms. Those are the only ones that are out of the norm. Everything else is fairly traditional with suspended cymbal and snare drum, bass drum, things like that. The last instrumentation challenge to note is the fact that mutes are programmed for the trumpets and for first trombone, and that would be in the second movement. Moving on to ranges and challenges. The key signatures, number 1, are going to be pretty challenging overall, because that concert A minor is kind of a funky key signature for some woodwind fingerings and whatnot. The move into F major is a little bit more manageable for most instruments. However, there are still some awkward fingerings, especially in that first movement. The next challenge to consider is the fact that there's an alto sax solo at the beginning of the first movement. You're definitely going to want to have a confident alto sax player. It's not all that technical, but all the times I've heard this piece, which is a decent number of times, the expressive elements and the vibrato are almost characteristic and expected whenever this piece is performed. And your younger alto sax player might be good as far as technicality is concerned, but if they don't have that tone and vibrato, that could end up making it not sound true to its nature. The next challenge is all clarinet parts, all three, cross the break, and the first even go up into the altissimo register, which is a challenge of its own. It definitely makes things a bit harder to figure out as far as the clarinet player's skill is concerned. The trumpets go up to a high A above the staff in the second movement especially. The horns go up to a D in the staff. There are glisses in the trombone, horn, and piccolo parts, which can be an added challenge technically. There's not a lot of consistency or 2D figures or function in the parts between, say, for example, first, second, and third clarinet. The clarinets are all doing different things at different times, and more often than not, they're not all playing the same rhythm, which can be demanding of individual players especially, and make it so that they need to be very independent even from their own section. Moving on to rhythms and percussion. First off, there are a variety of time signatures with compound patterns. Most of the second movement is in a 6/8 plus 2/4 feel. It's notated in 5/4 time, but it's this subdivision of the beat of 3 plus 3 plus 2 plus 2. You can see the part to the trumpet up above my head that shows this kind of pattern. The groupings of the eighth notes kind of make it a bit easier to tell where the subdivisions of the beats are, which is great technique to use to show that. And of course, there are score notes as well that Frank Ticheli writes to let you know that that's the pattern that this will be in for the most part. Then the next thing I noticed, and I really like this about Frank Ticheli, he's very thoughtful about the percussion. Most of the time composers will just throw the percussion parts at them and say, okay, figure this out. But Frank Ticheli, he says, okay, this can be covered by one part, this one can be covered by two, and so you can know exactly the number of percussionists you need to pull this off. In this case, he suggests 5 percussionists. The other rhythmic challenge of this is there are 16th notes everywhere, which definitely makes this a bit harder, especially for the instruments that are not usually as agile and not used to playing 16th notes. It definitely will demand you to have mature and rhythmically literate players that can do that technical aspect. Moving on to my overall recommendation, I'm going to say no, especially from the small school angle on this. You'll see more of why and my keys to success on this, which there are a few more than usual just because of the nature of this piece. The first key to success is you're going to have a larger band to accommodate 3-part on basically everything. Us small schools, it's significant if I can get up to 20 students in band. And I would say this would require closer to 30 students to be able to fully fill this out. Most small schools would be barely approaching that as far as my knowledge is concerned. And especially at this skill level where it's probably going to be either a high school group or if it's a combined group, then you're going to have a lot of challenge with your younger players because pretty much every part is going to have those demands on them. So not only numbers, but the quality of those players. Your band will also need to have rhythmic literacy for these more complex time signatures. You're going to need to have clarinet players that can play altissimo comfortably and not be falling flat, not be squeaking all over the place, which is definitely a challenge. I've very seldom seen any middle school literature call for that. So I would call this more of a high school level piece at the least. Then you'll need to have percussionists that can play both mallets and battery equally because the percussion one part switches between battery percussion and mallet percussion. I know in a lot of schools, percussionists tend to gravitate towards what they're good at. So you'll have to have several well-rounded percussionists that can play multiple different roles, as opposed to just sticking in the mallets role or sticking in the snare drum, bass drum role, etc. Next, as you probably would have figured, you're going to need to have a confident alto sax player that can play expressively. And lastly, you'll definitely need to have the mutes for the trombone and trumpets, because it really changes the characteristic sound in this recording, and it doesn't list them as optional. So that being said, really cool piece of music, one of the great standards out there that's been around for 30 plus years and still getting a lot of playtime today. Honestly, it's one of my favorites to play. I've played it 2 or 3 times now in my playing career. It has been very enjoyable each time. Let's go ahead and move on to our next piece, which is the Great Locomotive Chase. All right, welcome back, everybody. That was the Great Locomotive Chase by Robert W. Smith. The key signature for this one is G minor, 2 flats. The genre style is thematic and historical. It's grade level 3, 4 minutes and 15 seconds long, 147 measures. The publisher is Bellwin Mills Incorporated, published in the year 1999. Tempos present are 144 beats per minute, 96 beats per minute, 64 beats per minute, and 152 beats per minute. Moving on to the composer, Robert W. Smith. We've already mentioned him before, and we know a lot about him. He loves doing this thematic stuff and making this thematic stuff very approachable for younger bands, especially. Once again, he recently passed away just last fall, sadly. He will leave quite a legacy with all the music that he wrote and all of the lives that he impacted with that. Moving on to the grade level. This is harder than it appears and harder than it's listed, mainly because of the demands on the entire band, I would say. And I think a lot of the elements of this are going to be technical and speed related. So tempo is going to play a factor in this. Moving on to instrumentation, there are 2 clarinet parts, 2 trumpet parts, and 1 of everything else. However, there is a part at the beginning that you probably heard that was calling for 3 flutes, where they do a train whistle triad that they enter in on and then kind of fade off into the distance. That obviously will require you to have 3 flutes, because it just won't sound the same even if you just have 2 flutes to play that chord. There are also some intentional dissonances in there, which what that has to do with instrumentation is you need to have a decent number of players to be able to make the dissonance sound right. So this piece implies that you should have more players playing it. Another thing to consider with instrumentation are the vocal effects that are present. And lastly, we need to make sure that we have a menagerie of percussion, both players and instruments. Some of the non-typical ones are an anvil or brake drum, train whistle, marimba, chimes, hi-hat, and then of course many of the other standard percussion instruments. Moving on to the ranges and challenges. There, first off, is a lot of right at the break and over the break in the first clarinet. You'll see a part above my head where it shows the clarinet 1 and clarinet 2 that are at one point in the music, like the first 2 measures. There's the upper clarinet part that jumps up to the A, B, C going between the break. And as a clarinet player, one recommendation I have for some of you that might not be clarinet players and look at that and say, how in the world do clarinets do that so fluently? What I would recommend is using your right hand to shade or shadow the keys, and you can actually play that A with most of your fingers down on your right hand, and it'll also help serve a dual purpose by bringing the pitch down and make it a lot less technically demanding for clarinets. However, it is still going to be a challenge moving that quickly as well. I would definitely recommend accommodating for that challenge level, especially for your first clarinet players, and make sure that they're really with it. Secondly, both clarinets go over the break instead of just one clarinet part. There are lots of solos to consider: flute, clarinet, saxophone, baritone, trumpet, horn. Almost every instrument has a solo of some kind. And if they don't, they have some kind of very important soli that they play, which means basically every one of your sections needs to be up to scratch to be able to play this. There's also lots of effectual playing. For example, the flutes are playing as a train whistle that I mentioned before. Next, the extreme dynamic demands, which you can see a trumpet part right above me once again, where you can see that there's the what we call TP accents or marcato accents above each note, and they're going from piano to fortissimo and then back down, presumably to piano, but it's still extreme amount of dynamics to cover in a very short span of time. Then there is a long gliss in the trombones in the middle of the piece where it's 3 whole notes glissed together, basically. That will be a bit of a challenge because trombones are used to the glisses just being like a quarter note up to a whole note and then maybe a fall off or something like that. But this one is a whole note to a whole note to a whole note. So up, down, and then back up again. That will require a decent amount of breath support from your trombones to be able to pull that off, especially at a louder dynamic level to draw attention to it. The next challenge is at measure 111 in the piece. The lows have a melody there that is not easy. It's moving, it's syncopated, it's jumping all over the place. I suppose it could be worse, but there are a lot of jumps and skips in there. That is definitely not going to be easy for your lows, and they will have to really have their technical abilities honed to be able to play that. Next, the trumpets go up to a high A above the staff, which is above what I usually would see in a level 3 piece, but not too significantly so. The horns go all the way up to an E in the staff, which that is definitely significant. Not the easiest thing to do for French horn, especially at a middle school or even lower high school age. Moving on to rhythms and percussion. There are tons of 16th notes. Other than that, though, the rhythms are pretty straightforward. There are lots of 8th notes and some syncopation, but that's to be expected, especially at this level of playing. Which I will also mention that the snare drum part and the hi-hat part is absolutely ridiculous. You heard it in there, and they were literally creating the effect of the train. The chicka 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 chicka. That was crazy fast snare drumming right there. 16 notes at 144 and 152 beats per minute. I can't even imagine doing that myself. So you're going to have a really dexterous percussion player to be able to do that. Lastly, there are 6 percussionists recommended for this piece of music, which is definitely slightly bigger than the average band. I know that with small schools, we don't tend to have large percussion sections. I was just really lucky this year to have a large percussion section. I had 6, and I'm now down to 5 because one of my students moved. But the fact that I had that many percussionists really shows how unusual that is for a small school. Moving on to my overall recommendation, I'm going to say sadly no, because mainly the numbers is going to be the biggest challenge, and being able to have students on every instrument that are in that upper level of experience to help carry the younger students that you inevitably have in a small school, it's not all that realistic. However, if you have like one good player on each of these instruments that'll help pull the group up, then you might have some business doing this piece. That being said, keys to success, basically what I just said, a decent sized band, probably closer to 30 people. One way you could solve that is by doing a collaboration with another school. I know with small schools, it's common to combine with another small school to form sports teams and stuff like that. And I've seen similar things happen with bands, and I actually do the same thing with a local school for our football games, because our athletes combine and so our bands combine, and it makes it a really good win-win situation. Situation like that might allow for this to happen. Moving on, you're going to need to have lots of soloistic players, like I said. You're going to need to have them be, once again, well-rounded on basically every instrument. You're going to need to have an oboe, horns, baritone, and some other specific instruments that small school bands may not have, or you might be rewriting some parts. And even then, that might be a little bit hard because of how many solos there are in other parts as well, and especially simultaneous ones like at the beginning of the piece. You're going to need to have some not typical percussion instruments, once again, like the chimes, the marimba, the brake drum. On that note, actually, I do have a suggestion, and I actually did this for one of the pieces that we're doing. I was looking for a brake drum, decided to go to our shop teacher because we don't have an automotive class or an automotive shop, and said, "Do you got a big hunk of metal?" And he goes, "I actually have just the thing." And he gives me this 25-pound block of welded metal, and I'm like, that will be perfect. It actually works quite well as a brake drum, and you can probably improvise in some way like that, or if you have your own shop at home, potentially, you could pull from that shop. Moving on from that, you need to have at least 3 flutes, like I discussed, to be able to do the authentic train whistle. You're going to need to have your woodwinds all be able to play very dexterously, like I said before. Once again, another really good and consistent snare drum player that can handle those high tempos and 16th notes. And of course, a confident low brass to be able to play that melody that's in the middle-ish end of the song. That's all I have to say about the Great Locomotive Chase. I really hope you enjoyed it. I definitely did, and would love to play it someday, or have one of my groups play it, but once again, bit of a challenge for us small school directors. Let's move on to our last piece, Equinox. Welcome back, everybody. Once again, that was Equinox by Ed Huckeby. The key signature is D minor, which is 1 flat. It's considered an overture. It is marked as a grade level 2.5. It is 4 minutes and 45 seconds long, 83 measures. The publisher is Birch Island Music Press. The year it was published is 1999. The tempos present are 72 beats per minute and 132 beats per minute. About the composer, Ed Huckeby is an arts advocacy consultant, a freelance composer, and has worked in secondary, higher education, and music administration. He lives in Oklahoma, and he was recently retired, but still does his consultant business. He's a clinician and a composer. Moving on to the grade level, this is definitely harder than a 2.5. The main thing that I point to, once again being a clarinet player natively, is the altissimo clarinet notes. A lot of different counter melodies and a lot of different things happening at the same time. Those are the main things I point to, which I would say is indicative of more of a high school piece as opposed to a middle school piece. Moving on to instrumentation, there are 2 clarinet parts, 2 alto sax parts, 2 trumpet parts, and 2 trombone parts. Everything else is 1 of each. This would call for typically about 5 percussionists. There's something I haven't seen before, which is an entire line of music dedicated just to cymbals, which usually cymbals fall under the auxiliary percussion part. No, it's its own cymbal part with 3 different cymbals in it. You'll need to have a crash cymbal, and when I say crash cymbal, I mean like the crash cymbal on a stand in a drum set, not the crash cymbals that crash together in concert band. You need to have a suspended cymbal and a ride cymbal as well. So imagine your cymbal player as almost like a drum set without the battery drums and whatnot, which is definitely a funny image in my mind, but I think that percussionists would really enjoy doing this. The reason for that is because there are overlapping parts slightly where you'll be doing a roll on the suspended cymbal, and then you'll have to move over and do a hit on that suspended cymbal and a crash on the crash cymbal. So you're hitting 2 cymbals at the same time in overlapping parts. There's not a lot of time for transition. There's also an independent French horn part, meaning you'll need to have a French horn at least. And interestingly, this is another thing that I haven't seen super often, or at all for that matter, which is the baritone / euphonium part and the bassoon are considered the same line part. So instead of the bassoon being up with woodwinds, it's grouped down there with the lower brass. It obviously ends up working because then you can at least have an alternative if you don't have a bassoon or you don't have a baritone. The other might be available in your band. Moving on to ranges and challenges. One of the nice ideas, actually, that's not a challenge necessarily, is the composer decided to use fermatas before any of the sudden tempo changes. This makes it so that the director can give some prep beats to give the new tempo, so it's not just a guess and give it a shot and hope for the best, which younger bands can definitely not do. I'm doing a piece right now that I've mentioned several times now in my recordings where this is not present and the tempo change is quite sudden and makes it really, really tough for my younger students. The next challenge that we have is both clarinets cross the break. The first even go up into the altissimo register, as I mentioned before. The trumpets go up to a high G above the staff. The French horn goes up to an E at the top of the staff. And there are the switching meters, the 6/8 and 7/8 time that are interspersed into the 4/4 time, which can definitely throw non-subdividing students through a loop to be able to navigate that and not fall behind or get ahead or just simply give up. There are also some really fun and complicated counter melodies, especially in the woodwinds. So you'll have to have really independent woodwind section to be able to play those counter melodies while the melody is happening, and on top of that to balance those 2 melodies together. The first and seconds parts of a lot of these are playing completely different things than each other, which makes things a bit more challenging, like I was mentioning before. So they're not doing the same rhythmic thing as each other a lot of the time, and requires more independence as players within a section. Lastly, the flutes get up into the stratosphere. I think they get up to maybe a high F, I want to say, way above the staff. And that's not a given for most flute players. And once you get up into that register, it's just really, really clunky trying to navigate it quickly, which this piece of music is definitely moving quick enough that that would be a typical challenge for flutes playing there. Moving on to rhythms and percussion, there are some 16th notes, which include dotted 8/16ths as well. Mainly, they are just runs in the flutes and clarinets and sometimes the saxophones, but there are some 16th notes in the brass as well. The next thing that I want to mention is the snare drum part is pretty hard. There are a lot of syncopated sticking patterns and adding rim shots into the part, which you don't normally see in symphonic band. You'll see notated above me that there's this drum part, and the rim shots are marked and notated with an X. They're having to do two-handed stuff where they're doing a rim shot with one and not a rim shot with the other, which that throws me, a non-native percussionist, through a loop a bit mentally. And then lastly, rhythm-wise, there are a lot of syncopated parts in the lows especially, but all around too. The trumpet melody has that syncopated pattern. The woodwinds have syncopation as well. It's definitely a challenging piece. Moving on to my recommendation. I'm going to say, probably not. The reason for that is there are a lot of keys to success on this one, and you're going to have some especially good clarinet and flute players to be able to play some of this technical stuff that's being asked for. It's not your run-of-the-mill middle school player that's going to be able to do this. Your middle schoolers, if you're dominantly middle school, your middle school students are going to have to be able to play at easily a high school level. So maybe if all your flutes and clarinets receive private lessons, then you might be able to pull this off, but odds are that's probably not the case. You need to have a solid low wind section because of these driving rhythms, and it's very easy to get behind on this, especially when other parts are doing other things. And once again, you're going to have that independence where they can just keep doing their thing, stay on tempo, and not pay too much attention to what everybody else is doing. You're going to also need to have a really good snare drum player. As I mentioned before, there are some really interesting parts that are kind of indicative of a drum set in a lot of ways. That's not always a typical skill set, especially of a middle school percussionist, unless of course you have a jazz program and your percussionist is in both concert band and jazz band. Then it might be a little bit easier, but not necessarily. Moving on from there, you're going to need to have a French horn or several to be able to play this, and you'll need either a bassoon or a baritone to be able to have all parts represented as well. Lastly, you'll need to have experience playing in minor keys, which this particular minor key is not the easiest, especially for clarinets and flutes. It's kind of a little bit of a foreign key signature and will definitely mean that your students are going to want to be practicing. That is everything that I have about Equinox by Ed Huckeby. Thank you everybody for joining me for this episode. You can leave any comments, feedback, or suggestions in the comments below the video, or you can email me at bandlitreviews@gmail.com. I hope you guys enjoyed band music of the 90s. I really enjoyed revisiting some of these pieces. I hope you all have a great rest of your school year. Thanks again for listening with me thus far, and I will see you all in the next episode.